Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Kuf Tet Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Shifra Adik in loving memory of her husband Tzvi Adik, Tzvi Dov ben Harav Moshe Noach V'Sara on his first year. We're going to get started. A few quick announcements. If you haven't listened yet to Din and Daf about the breakaway Mikdash in Egypt, a very worthwhile listen. In fact, someone just before class said how great it was. Also, she mentions, and maybe I should mention it as well, Sugya B'Ktana in Hebrew went up yesterday about specifically the Bechorot and the Kohanim and that whole issue. I wanted to just say one thing. I know it's toward the end of our Masechet already, but this will be true for the next one as well, and you can always go back, and maybe it's a good idea at the end of the Masechet. One of the issues that I think many of us are grappling with this Masechet is the relevance of it, and also the Dapim are very long, and we don't have time to think about the bigger ideas. And the extra, that's exactly why we have the Beyond the Daf content. It's all to give you the perspective and the background, the bird's eye view, exactly what we don't get in Daf Yomi. So I know not everybody has time. Also listen to Daf Yomi and also listen to those extra shirim. But if you pick one or two at the end of the Masechet to kind of listen to and give you perspective, I think that will be helpful. In addition, which is a good lead into the Siyum also, right? The goal of the Siyum always is to give a little perspective. And we're excited to have Dr. Malka Simkovich with us, who's really going to help us with that perspective. And we're going to hear from Natalie Taylor, one of our DAF learners, her experience learning the Masechet Zevachim. These are all good ways to kind of sum up and kind of look from perspective at the Masechet. Okay. Also, the Megillah Challenge is starting on Monday, same day as we're finishing the Masechet. I mean, our Siyum will be Sunday. Monday, the Megillah Challenge is starting, so whoever wants to take it on, or as I've always mentioned, it's a great opportunity to send on to friends and family to try to encourage others to start learning. Okay, with that, let's get started. So let's just go back for a quick minute. We were in the middle of this Breita that was describing. Okay, we had a Breita that we quoted to talk about what kind of was before. Okay, before the Mishkan was put up. So everything was able to be used. We said, we're going to learn this from Noach. Okay, Noach is our great example because what does Noach do? And maybe we should go through the story again, right? We're used to growing up on, and I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday. We grew up on Noach brought in 2 of every animal. But what's a little bit less known is that Noach also brought in 7 of each of the kosher animals. Okay? And why? Because at the end, he's going to sacrifice from those animals, okay? And he brings sacrifices, and specifically from kosher animals. But we're going to see, he brings, okay, and this is the pasuk we quoted at the end of yesterday's daf, Vayiven Noach, after the flood is over and he comes out of the ark, Vayiven Noach, Mizbech LaHashem, Vayikach mikol ha'behema ha'torah u'mikol ha'of ha'torah. And then he takes from all the kosher and the non-kosher, kosher animals and the kosher birds, and he offers them up as sacrifices. So from here, we're going to learn about sacrifices for Bnei Noach before Matan Torah, before the Torah is given, and before really the Mishkan is erected. So behema kemashma'o, so behema obviously animals, chaya bichlal behema. That's where we ended yesterday. Undomesticated animals are really usually included in behemot unless we have a reason to not include them. And even though in the temple we only bring domesticated animals, in those days you were able to bring non-domesticated animals. Now we're going to learn something else from that pasuk. Notice it puts behemah right next to oaf. So now we're going to learn zcharim u'nikevot. So first of all, it could be male and female. This is again a quote from the Breita that we quoted yesterday. Tmimim u'balei mumim. Da'amar bar tamut uzcharu bebehemah ve'ein tamut uzcharu be'ofot. Okay, so now the issue of behemah tamah, like an unblemished or a non-blemished animal, and male, there has to be a male animal for an ola, we're talking about for burnt offerings. There is no such thing like that in birds. And itakash behemah la'of tmimim u'balei mumim la. Okay, so now they say and behemah and of are together in the same pasuk. So if you could bring male and female for the birds, you could bring male and female for the animals. If you could bring blemished animals for the birds, you could bring blemished animals for if there is no blemishes, we learned this. There's no blemishes for birds. To which the Gemara says, well, it says blemished and non-blemished animals, but it doesn't mean if it's missing a limb. If it's missing a limb, that's a different story. Okay? Then you can't bring it, because that even for a bird is an issue. Okay, in terms of the male, this is all before the Torah was given. Yes, it could be the burnt offerings could be brought females before. That's the whole idea here. What normally holds true does not hold true there. Now that I'm a Rabbi Elazar, we actually learned this sugya. Okay, I didn't remember exactly where we learned it, but according to the Masarat Shas, it's in Avodah Zarah. Okay, in Avodah Zarah we learned this. That's why it sounds familiar. How do we know that Mechusar Ever is forbidden to Bnei Noach? Okay, so Talmud Lomal Mikol Hachai Asher Mikol Basal. Okay, we're back to Noach. We're going to learn all these things from Noach. Okay, it says Mikol Achai Mikol Basal Shnayim Mikol Tavia Lateva Lahachayot Itach Zachar Nikevayu. Now it's a little confusing because it's actually learning this just about the pairs of animals that came in, even though we really want to learn from it to the ones that were brought as sacrifices, but we're going to ignore that point right now. Okay, because this is the world of drasha and things are allowed that might not necessarily be otherwise. Mikol Achai Mikol Basal, and also by the way, whatever you brought in, right, would have to also the ones who sacrificed were also among those who were brought in. So still, it would be applicable. Now, it says, Mikol achai mikol basar, for everything living, from every flesh. Amra Torah, havei be'emah shechayin, rashei avarim shela. What does it mean, Mikol achai, from everything living? Well, it means that not only are they living, but their limbs are completely alive and they don't have a broken limb. Okay, we could have stopped here. Now the Gemara is going to ask a question. Vidilma, and we had this whole sugya in Avodah Zarah, Vidilma l'mi'utei treifa. Maybe Mikol Achai is coming to say an animal that will live and not an animal that's sick that's going to die within the next 12 months, which is usually the basic definition of a treifa. Well, they're saying, we learned that from a different pasuk. Okay, and the whole thing is going to be here. We're going to have two tracks because it's going to depend on what you hold on some other machloket. The whole time we're going to want to keep Mikol Chai free to teach us Mechusar Ever, if it's missing a limb. To do that, we're going to have to find a different pasuk for treifa. So the first pasuk they're going to find for treifa is l'chayot zera, which is, right, you have to bring animals that can reproduce. Which obviously makes sense in the Tevet. That was why he was bringing animals in. Well, if you say that a treifa can't reproduce, then it makes sense. But who's to say a treifa can't reproduce? And there's a machloket about it. Whether an animal that's a treifa, okay, this actually sounds like a machloket about the mitziyut, about the reality. Can an animal that's defined as a treifa reproduce or not? So if you say a treifa can't reproduce, then great. We learn it from l'chayot zera, and our pasuk kol chai, every living thing, is used to teach even the limbs have to be living and you can't have them broken. Ela lamanda amar treifa yoledet. But if you say that a treifa is yoledet, can reproduce or can give birth, right? How are you going to explain this? Because then we really need, right? L'chayot zera can't teach us about a treifa. So now we have to find a different pasuk for the treifa so that we can keep our pasuk free for our drasha. Ha'amar kra itach b'domim lach. Now, if you remember this, right? Noach has to bring him to the teva with him. So what do they say? With you, him? With you means like you. And Noach obviously wasn't a treifa, and therefore the animals can't be a treifa. So they say, what do you mean? Maybe Noach was a treifa. Okay, they ignore the fact that he lived many years after, but actually I don't remember exactly how old he was when he died, but I got to assume he didn't die right after. I don't remember the years, but anyway, Dilma Noach gufei treifa hava. Maybe Noach himself is a treifa. And then Itcha could be bringing treifas just like you. Well, they're going to try one attempt to prove he wasn't a treifa. They're not going to succeed. Then they're going to try another attempt. Tamim k'tiv be. Well, it says he was tamim. Now, normally we think tamim was he was complete, not in a physical way, but in his characteristics. He was a good person. But now they're saying tamim is the language of unblemished, right? That's what we use for animals. Maybe it means he was unblemished, meaning he wasn't a treifa. Well, dilma tamim b'drachav. No, maybe that's talking about his midot, right? His characteristics, his traits. Tzaddik tiv be. No, it says he was a tzaddik. That would say that tamim must be left then to tell you he wasn't a treifa. Dilma tamim b'drachav tzaddik b'masa. No, tamim and tzaddik are not the same thing. Tamim describes your personality traits, and your midot, but tzaddik would describe your actions, right? So those are two different things. So you could still say tamim is not saying he wasn't a treifa. So now they're going to try a different track. So you can't prove it from there. Now we're going to say, okay, thank you for that, Becky, that Noach lived 950 years and after the flood 350. Okay. Anyway, Isal gadatach the Noach gufei treifa hava mika armalei de Noach de kavatech ayil. Sorry, let me read that better. Isal gadatach the Noach gufei treifa hava. If you really want to say it was a treifa, now we're going to do it by process of elimination kind of thing. Either he was a treifa or he wasn't a treifa. Now, if he was a treifa, then itcha makes no sense because what is itcha? take animals that are like you. Now, if he's a treifa, take animals that are like you that are treifas. What was our whole proof? Take animals that are like you because you're not a treifa. How do we know you're not a treifa? Well, exactly for that reason. Because if itcha means like you, what God's saying, bring other animals that are like you that are treifot and not whole, complete animals, that makes no sense. So it must have been he wasn't a treifa from that pasuk. Okay, so now we're going to say, fine. So now we have itcha teaches you it can't be a treifa. And then that leaves open our pasuk. But if you remember, let's just go back and talk about the structure. We started with our pasuk mikol chai. Mikol basal, that proves anything with a broken limb isn't in. Right? In other words, again, can't go into the teva and then can't be sacrificed. Now we say, wait a minute, maybe that's treifa. So we had two tracks. One track is going to learn from l'chayot zera, because they can't reproduce and have children. But if you say they can, then we have this itcha. But now they say, once you have itcha, that should apply to both, whether you hold that a treifa can reproduce or not reproduce. So, that we don't even need that first attempt that we had, that first track. We can ignore that first track and say l'chayot zera doesn't mean to exclude a treifa because we have itcha already, which would be according to everybody. So what do we do with l'chayot zera? By the way, we read this entire sugya in Avodah Zarah. Okay, it went from here to the end. You might have thought itach, when it says itach, you might have thought maybe that means to be with Noach. So he had company in the teva, bring all these animals. How much company and how much fun it was to have all these animals in the ark, but maybe to be with you. Afilu zaken, afilu saris, and then you could take even an old animal or even a saris, anyone who can't reproduce. Kamashma, and that's why it had to say l'chayot zera, that Noach had to understand you had to take young animals that could still reproduce, and that's what that l'chayot zera is for. And with that, again, we still have our pasuk free, because in the end, itcha is teaching treifa, and our pasuk is teaching limbs. So really, if we just summarize in a second, what we did so far is we proved how we know zcharim and nekevot v'yimim u'ba'alei mumim are in. And that we did from the hekesh of the be'emah to the of. And then we moved from there to say, mechusar ever though is not. Okay, even though the Bereishit didn't say that, it's obvious it's not, and that we learned from a pasuk. And then we just had a whole back and forth about that. Now, let's go back to the Gemara. Torim, now we're back to the Braita that we quoted before. Torim avalot tmeim. Pure but not impure, meaning kosher but not non-kosher. So they can't sacrifice non-kosher animals. But what? There was no kosher, non-kosher. So what are you talking about? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. Now, yeah, there's a girsa. There's a lot of girsa problems in today's Gemara. Instead of reading it like this, the notes say read ha'atidin litahil. What it means is one that in the future will be kosher. We're going to have to figure out, right? If we go back to Noach, then, well, how did Noach know which, right? It says very clearly, now why they picked Noach as the example? Because it says by Noach, he took, right, 7 of the pure, of the kosher, and 2 of the non-kosher. So how did he know? Manav yade. The Torah wasn't given. How did he know which ones yes, which ones no? And then obviously that affects us, right? That everyone else was able to take from the kosher and the non-kosher. So how did Noach know? Rav Chisda said, "Haviran lifnei hateva, kol shateva kolateto biyadua shu tahor, ein hateva kolatetam biyadua shein tmeim." It was this miraculous thing that happened. Noach kind of brought all the animals in front of the teva in groups of 7. If the teva took them in, then they were taken in. If not, not. Okay, so basically that's how he knew which were the Torim, which were the Tmeim. He wasn't Jewish, but that's not the issue here. The issue is everyone before Matan Torah, before actually the tabernacle is put up, can only sacrifice kosher animals. Okay? Now, again, they're trying to keep within what the Torah says. So, and this is also Noachide laws, right? You could say within that, right? If you're going to be a Ben Noach and you want to bring sacrifices and you want to do it right, this is the way to do it. So Noach, when he brought these sacrifices, how did he know which of the animals of 7? It was a miracle. The doors opened up and let them in, or the doors closed, right? You think of these chips and stuff, they had the chips in them that could open the door. They didn't. Rabbi Yavahu Amal, now this is actually no less miraculous, but it happens in a bit of a different way. Amarkra habaim, now this is a very strange pasuk. It says, V'haba'im, and the ones who came in, Zachar and Nekeva, male and female, Mikol Basar Ba'u, right, from all types of animals came. Kasher Tziva Oto Elohim, like God commanded, V'yizgor Hashem Ba'ado, and God closed the ark, and then they went off. Now, what do they say? Haba'im. It sounds like the animals went in on their own, but isn't it that Noach brought them in? No. Haba'im Elehen. They came on their own. So basically, the kosher animals knew they were kosher, and they came in. That's why I think this is still miraculous, right? Only the kosher ones came in sevens, and the non-kosher ones came in twos, and that's how Noach knew. So either Noach was actively involved in this miracle happening by bringing them and seeing what happens, or not, or it just happened on its own. Amar. Now we're going back to another line. Hakol kirvu olo. They all, now, before the tabernacle was erected, it sounds like they only brought korbanot olah. I have a whole slew of questions on this. Olot in shlamim lo. It sounds like they didn't bring peace offerings. Now remember, what's an olah? The whole thing gets burned. So it sounds like they didn't bring peace offerings, which were offerings that people would eat from. V'aktiv. But wait, it says, okay, in the pasuk after Matan Torah, what does it say? V'yizbechu Zevachim shlamim la'Hashem parim. It's the pasuk we quoted yesterday with the bechorim, the firstborns. So they sacrificed Zevachim shlamim la'Hashem parim. That sounds very clear. They did shlamim. Ela ema hakol kirvu olot ushlamim. Okay, so now there's problems with the gears. I'm going to try to read as best as I can. The bottom line is the same either way. Everyone brought, well, actually not necessarily. There are some who have a bit of a different understanding, but everyone brought olot and shlamim, to which they say v'hatanya, but there's a braita that says aval shlamim lo ki im olot. No, they didn't bring shlamim, just olot. Olot in shlamim lo, there it sounds like they didn't bring shlamim. Kemanda amar lo kirvu shlamim b'nei Noach. What we're going to basically make a distinction is between the b'nei Noach and the Jews. Jews could bring shlamim, and that's why at Matan Torah we brought shlamim, but non-Jews can't bring shlamim. Okay, and that's the distinction they're going to make. There's some explanation of Rabbeinu Hananel that says they would bring peace offerings but offer them as burnt offerings, without getting into that, but there are some other understandings. But anyway, it sounds like they're basically going to, the simple reading of the sugya is we're differentiating Jews and non-Jews. So now we're going to have some questions on this. First, we want to point out this is a machloket tanaim, whether Bnei Noach were able to bring shlamim or not. So this braita that we said they all can only bring olot, obviously, in other words, then we're going to say, just to explain what we did so far, when we say everyone brings olot, that means Bnei Noach as well, but Jews can also bring shlamim, even though it doesn't say that. Now we're going to see that whether or not the non-Jews, the Bnei Noach, can bring shlamim is actually machloket tanaim, in which case our braita only holds by one opinion. So here we're going to see it. De'itmar, it was said. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, we don't know who says what. Chad Amar, one said kirvu shlamim b'nei Noach, v'chad Amar lo kirvu. And now we're going to see first what's the proof text, and then we're going to ask some difficulties from things that happen historically. So one of the proofs is going to be from a historical situation. My time in demand Amar kirvu shlamim b'nei Noach. How do you know they did bring shlamim if you hold they did? Dichtiv vehevel, okay, Abel, Hevel, he brought, if you remember, Hevi, he brings a korban to God. Gamhu mi bechorot sono, from the firstborns of his sheep, ume chel behen. Now, what is chel behen? And from their fats. Now, ezu davar shechobo karev l'gabei mizbeach ein kulo karev l'gabei mizbeach. It sounds like he only offered up the fats to God, not the whole animal. What's that? That's a shlamim, right? Havei omer says shlamim. So the fact that Hevel, Abel, brought shlamim, that would prove Bnei Noach can bring shlamim. My time at demand amar lo kirvu. Now, if you say they didn't bring shlamim, dichtiv, completely different pasuk, definitely taking a pasuk out of context. It's a pasuk in Shira Shirim. Uri tzafon uboi teman. Okay, wake up tzafon and come teman. Tzafon is north, teman is south. So what does this mean? Why Uri? Titna'el umash ma'aseh tzafon. We're going to get rid of the nation who brings only in the north. Now, what's the north? Remember, where do you slaughter in the north? Ezu mukoman shel Zevachim, right? Where are things slaughtered? Ola slaughtered only in the north. So get rid of the nation that only brings from the north, which are the non-Jews. V'tavo uma shema'aseh b'tzafon u'b'daron. And will come in the nation, right? This is kind of the choosing of the Jewish people, the nation that brings both in the tzafon and the darom. And that's this pasuk in Shir Shirim. They're saying this is making a reference to the Jewish people, that they're going to be in, the other ones are going to be out. And how do they differentiate? The ones who bring only in the north and the ones who bring in the north and in the south, because the shlamim can be slaughtered in the south. And that's a reference to the fact that there's this differentiation. And that's the proof text. Bit of a strange proof text. It's going to be more strange as the Gemara is going to say, what does each one do with the other pasuk? It seems a little strange that we have to say to someone, what are you going to do with that pasuk? How are you not explained it that way? It seems that's not exactly the simple way to read that pasuk. But anyway, that's what we're going to do right now. What does each one do with the other one's pasuk? So, Umar Nami Haktiv Mechal Behen. The second opinion, why isn't it whole? What about Hevel? Misham Mishminehom, from the fattest of his firstborns. In other words, it's not from the fat of the firstborn animal. He took from the firstborns and then he found the best, fattest ones, and those he offered to God completely. Okay, easy way to explain that pasuk. Marnami Haktiv Uri Tzafon. What does he do with that other? What does the first opinion do with that pasuk? It's talking about the ingathering of the exiles. It has nothing to do with our pasuk, with our issue. Okay. Now we're going to start with some questions. V'haktiv v'yomer Moshe gamatati tem biyadenu Zevachim va'olov asinu l'Hashem Elokeinu. Now the assumption is the Jews. Now here, even before, what we're going to say is even before it sounds like the Jews couldn't even bring korbanot shlamim. And what does Moshe ask Paro that we can do? Bring Zevachim and olot. So now Zevachim la'achila, olot la'hakrava. So they say. No, Zevachim he asks, because usually Zevachim are shlamim. So what do we say? No, the Zevachim actually were for eating, just for slaughtering and eating, not for offering sacrifices. And, right, because what's the issue here? Before Matan Torah, Jews are like Bnei Noach. So the idea here is that if Bnei Noach, in other words, Bnei Noach, could only bring olot, but Jews could bring olot and shlamim, but only once the Torah was given. And this is before the Torah was given. So they say, no, Zevachim were just for eating, and olot were for sacrificing. V'haktiv, okay, another problem. Vayikach yitro chotei Moshe olah u'zvachim. Here it says he took olah and zevachim, and it's very clear he offered them up as sacrifice. So now, when does this happen? Okay, this happens in chapter 18. When we see Yitro heard, which we're going to get to a three-way debate. What did Yitro hear? That he came to Moshe, and then he sits with Moshe, they bring these sacrifices, and then the whole thing happens with Yitro sees Moshe working from morning to night, and he says you shouldn't judge, he gives him all these ideas about judging the people, and then that section ends, okay, and that's right after Amalek, and the next thing that happens is Matan Torah. So obviously this is before Matan Torah. And then what was he doing? And now you have to also assume that Yitro converted, okay, but which the Midrash says, what was he doing? Doing Olah and Zevachim before Matan Torah? Ha'ula achar Matan Torah u'dichtiv. Oh, they say, what do you mean? That was after Matan Torah. Okay, now in the Torah, it's before Matan Torah. But there's ein mukdam mu'achar b'Torah. There's no clear order in the Torah. You can say things happen before. And now we're going to see there's been machloket about when this Yitro story happened, and that's going to be dependent on what did Yitro hear that made him come and convert. Okay, so first before we see that big machloket, we're going to say that only works if you say Yitro was after Matan Torah, that story. But how are you going to explain it if he holds it was before Matan Torah, and then how did Yitro bring shlamim? Now here we're going to get the machloket. B'nei Rabbi Chia v'Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Chad amar Yitro kodem Matan Torah, v'Chad amar Yitro achar Matan Torah. Okay, these two Emoraim argue about whether it was before or whether it was after. Right now it's an Emoraitic debate. Soon we're going to see it's a Tanaitic debate. Okay, Lamanda amar Yitro kodem Matan Torah, kasavar shlamim ikrivu b'nei Noach. They're going to say this fits perfectly with the other machloket we saw. There was this whole machloket. Did they bring shlamim? Or did they only bring olot? So remember, there was an opinion that they brought shlamim. That was based on understanding what Hevel did, that he brought shlamim. So they say, if you hold Yitro was before Matan Torah, then he must hold that they brought shlamim. And that's why they have no problem with Yitro before Matan Torah bringing shlamim, because Bnei Noach brought shlamim. And then the two machlokot fit in with each other. Now we're going to see Kitanai. Now we're going to see this big machloket Tanaim about this. Vayishma Yitro kohen Midyan. So that's how it starts out. Parsha Yitro. Yitro hears and he comes. Mashmua Shama Uba v'nitgeir. So what did he hear and converted? Rabbi Yeshua Omer Melchemet Amalek Shama Shari Ktiv B'tzido Vaychlosh Yeshua Amalek V'etamol Lefi Charev. Right, they just won the battle against Amalek, and therefore from there, right? Just 1 second. I want to see one thing. Right. So they just won the battle of Amalek. That's what Yitro hears, and that's when he says, "Oh, I want to come convert." Rabbi Elazar Modi Omer Matan Torah Shama Uba. Now we're going to hear a long speech about this. of Rabbi Elazar Hamodai. He heard about Matan Torah. How do we know this? When they got Matan Torah, it was such a powerful event. God's voice was heard around the world, everywhere. All the kings of the other nations were sitting in their palaces, heard the sound of God, and they got scared. And they started to say shira, to say praise. What does it mean behechalo kulo? Usually we think it's in the hechal of God, kulo mer kavod. But no. It's saying the hechalim of all the other nations, they were saying kavod to God. They were giving respect to God. Nitkaptzu kulam etza bilam rasha. So they all went to Bilam. They heard this noise and they said, "What is this?" And they figured they go to the Navi, the prophet of theirs. Bilam is like the prophet of the non-Jews, again, according to this midrash. Obviously, it wasn't known to everybody probably, but according to this midrash, they all went to Bilam. V'amrulo, ma kol ha'amon asher shamanu. What is this noise we're hearing? Shema mabul ba'olam. Now they're worried there's a mabul. Okay, now what they're going to do here is they're going to darshan this parak of Tehillim that we say Friday night in our davening. You'll see it in a minute. Maybe there's a mabul. How do we know this? So he says to them, right? They say Hashem lamabul yashav. They say maybe God is yashav. Okay, this is from the parak Tehillim that we say Friday night in davening, right? Avul Hashem b'nei elim, avul Hashem kavod va'oz, all that. So Hashem lamabul yashav. God is going to return the flood, and they're nervous, right? It's a noise. They don't know what this noise is. Amar lahem vayeshav Hashem melech l'olam. It says no. That's in the continuing, right? In that Tehillim, God will sit as king of the world, but vayeshav, they learn is from nishpa. God promised, he swore. A lot of talk about Noach today, right? He promised he's not going to bring another flood. So don't worry, there won't be a flood. Fine, he's not going to bring a flood of water. Maybe he's going to bring a flood of fire. And they quote a pasuk from Yeshayahu, Ki ba'esh Hashem nishpat. God will rule with fire. So maybe he's judging us with fire. No, God will judge with fire. Amar lahem, kfar nishpa she'eno meshchit kol basar. Okay, in the promise of the flood, he says, I'm not going to destroy all the people of the world, so don't worry. Okay, so ma kol hamod hazeh sheshamanu. So they go back and say, what is this noise? Amar lahem chemda tova yesh lo bebeit knazav. He has a very special treasure that he's been hiding. Shayta genuza etzlo 974 dorot kodem shenivra olam. Okay, for 974 generations before the creation, God's been saving this. Okay, what's this number? So it says Asher tziva le'elef dor, that God commanded for 1,000 generations. That means the way they darshan it, God said, I'm not going to give you the Torah till after creation for 1,000 generations. Now, it was 26 generations after the creation of the world they got the Torah. So they say that what happened after God said that, he realized that I don't want to wait that long. So he pushed off the creation, so there would be much less time, and left it at 26 generations. Okay, why, what to do with this? You can have a lot of thoughts about it. We're not going to spend time on it now. So it's been waiting for 974 years from before the world was created. He's been hiding it. And now, obviously, since the world's been created, another 26, he's been hiding it. That's how the Perek Tehillim ends. God is giving strength, this amazing gift. And Patkul Kulam Vamru, and then they all responded, Hashem Yivarech et Amo B'Shalom. God will bless his people peacefully, because they all said, wow. Okay. With peace. Okay. Rabbi Eli, so that was opinion number 2. He heard about the Torah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kriyat Yam Suf Shama'u Ba. Okay, he heard about the splitting of the sea. This one's going to get a little explicit sexual content, so beware for a minute. But right now he heard, you're wondering how this is going to connect with that. Okay, you'll see in a minute. Kriyat Yam Suf Shama'u Ba. So he heard about the splitting of the sea. Makes a lot of sense. That was not so long before. So first of all, you already see here, the one who said he heard about Matan Torah, he didn't mention this, but obviously that means the Yitro story happened after Matan Torah. You couldn't have heard about Matan Torah before it happened. That's the obvious reason why we brought this. Okay, heard about Kriyat Yam Suf. How do we know this? It says, Vayhi kishmoa kol malchei Amori. This is a very strange pasuk. They're bringing it here because this is actually talking about when all the Amorite kings in Joshua heard about the splitting of the Jordan, not the splitting of the Red Sea. Some people say if they heard about that, they must have heard about the splitting of the Red Sea. Some people say if they only brought this because of this thing they're going to bring up about the next quote, and that it's not really necessary at this point in the Gemara. This is the real important one. When they come, the Meraglim, the spies that Joshua sends, they go to Rachav, the prostitute's house. Now you can see where we're getting to some sexual content. She says to them, Ki shamanu et asher hovish Hashem et Mei Suf. We heard that God split the sea. So she's talking about it, much later. Obviously, they must have heard then. Ma'ishna hatam damar. Now, this is why they brought that pasuk about the Malchei Amori. There it says, V'lo hayabam od ruach, and they had no more winds in them, right? They took the winds out of their sails. U'ma'ishna hacha, but when Rachav says it, she says, V'lo kama od ruach bi'ish. Okay, instead of saying they didn't have, it says that it didn't stand up any ruach in a person, in the man. What does that mean? Turning now to Amubet, Dafilo akshuye nami lo ikashu. None of them were able to have any erections. How do we know this? Menayada, how did she know this? Right? That's what she said. They were so scared that they couldn't have erections anymore. Okay, the Gemara says, or somebody said, that there was no important officer in the world that didn't have relations with this prostitute. She was the most famous prostitute there was. Amru, and this is what they say about her, about Esther Shanim Aitak She'asu Yisrael Mitzrayim. She was 10 when they got out of Egypt. V'zantak kol 40 shana Yisrael b'midbar. Okay, and for those 40 years, she was prostitute. Achar 50 shana, when she was 50, nitgaira, she converted. Amra yehem achuli b'schar chevel chalonu pishin. She said, please forgive all my sins for the reward that I get for the rope, for the window, and for the flax. Because what happened? She hid the spies in the flax, right, when she heard they were coming to get them, and then she let them out the window through the rope. So basically, through those three things that she saved the spies, she wanted to get forbidden for her sins. Okay, so that was all just to tell us the third opinion, that it was Kriyat Yam Suf that they heard, and that all connected with, if it was Matan Torah, it must have been Matan Torah happened before, and that was to explain why, according to the one who says that B'nai Noach don't bring shlamim, well, and even the Jews don't bring until after Matan Torah. Well, this was after Matan Torah, and obviously Yitro converted. Okay, and then he was a Jew. Okay, last part of the Braita. Amar v'goyim bisman hazeh r'she'in la'asok. Okay, now what they really mean by this is non-Jews nowadays, and any time really, can bring sacrifices on bamot. There's no such thing as shkutei chutz, hala'at chutz. It's just not relevant for Gentiles. How do we know this? Minan Emile, the Tanu Rabbanan, the Braita says, notice the pasuk that we read a whole bunch of times, that starts off the whole section in Vayikra Yud Zayin of Shkutei Chutz and Halat Chutz, doing things outside. Daber B'nei Yisrael. First it's Daber Aaron V'Albanav, and B'nei Yisrael. B'nei Yisrael mitzavin al Shkutei Chutz, ve'en goyim mitzavin al Shkutei Chutz. Here you see, only for Jews is this commandment, not relevant for non-Jews. Leficha kol chavecha bonelo b'mal atzmo makriv alei kol mashiach yirtzeh. Therefore, any Gentile that wants, if they want to be halachic about it, right, they can build anywhere they want and offer sacrifices. And even, right, nowadays when we don't bring sacrifices anymore, they still can. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha Amar Ravasi, Asur l'saya'an v'lasot shlichutam, but we cannot help them. We can't be part of it, and we can't be a messenger for them. Now, Amar Rabba ulo'irinu shari. But to teach them how to do it right, if they want to do it right, we can teach them. How do we know? Because we have a story. He had to Ifra Hormes, Ime de Shabor Malka. Remember Shabor Malka? He's the Persian king. His mother, Ifra Hormes, who we've also heard of before. His mother, Shadra Korban al Rava. She sends a sacrifice to Rava, an animal basically. And Shal Chalei, she sends to him, Askuani alei l'shem shamayim. Please offer it up for me. He doesn't have a way to offer up sacrifices. So what does he do? Amar lu l'Rav Safra l'Rav Acha bar Huna. He takes two rabbis, says to them, Zilu, Udabaru trei ulmekolai. Go take two very strong men, or beautiful men, some people say, or strong, beautiful something, but two men, Gilai, they say of the same age, not clear why, but he wants this to be done in the most perfect, beautiful manner possible. So he wants like two men that look similar, as if like that'll be nicer. Chazu hecha demaska yamasirton, and see where the water is letting up some foam. Okay, what we basically want to find is a place in the middle of the water where there's some like a sand drift, and there's a bunch of underground water, soil that's coming up from underneath. What's the main thing here? No one's ever touched it. It's untouched, like virgin land, as we call it. V'shkulu tzivei chadete, and take brand new wood that's never been used. V'afiku nura mimare chadeta, and make the fire from using a flint, something like a new vessel. Make a fire from something that's never been used before. V'askoni alei l'shem shamayim, and then offer it up. These two Gentile men are going to offer it up. In other words, he basically advised how to do it. He didn't advise her, but he advised other people to do it for her, but Gentiles, not him. He couldn't do it himself, so he asked them. Amar Abai, when Abai hears about this thing that Rava did, okay, Rava was arguing, he says, Kima, who are you doing this? Ki Rabbi Lazar ben Shamoah? You must be doing it according to him. In other words, what he wants to understand is, why do you use new wood? Where do you get this from? You have to use new wood. So, Ditanya, Rabbi Lazar ben Shamoah Omer, Ma mizbeach shalei yishtamesh bo hidyot, af itzim shalei yishtamesh ben hidyot. The first part of his argument is, I'm assuming you're holding like him, and then he's going to bring a problem with that. So, it seems like it's obvious that to build the altar, and that's why he took the virgin soil, to build the altar, you need to have virgin soil. It's never been used before. That seems to be a given. But the wood, who says it can't be used for anything? So he says, must be Rabbi Lazar ben Shamoah says, just like the Mizbech, also the wood. But there's a problem, because Hamudeh Rabbi Lazar ben Shamoah bebama. He only thinks that's in the temple, not in the bamot. How do we know that? Titanya. Kachuv echad omer. Now we're going to get into a whole thing about when David, these two psukim, that when David bought the land for the temple. This is okay, because David buys the land for the temple before he dies. And we're going to see two different psukim, one in Sefer Devrei Yamim, the first one, the second one in Sefer Shmuel. And it says the following: V'yitain David la'arnon b'makom shiklei zahav. Okay, notice they're gold. We're only going to come back to that later. Gold in shkalim, mishkal shesh me'ot. 600, the weight of 600 gold coins. Uktiv, and it says in the pasuk of Shmuel bet, Vayiken David et hagoren ve'et habakar. He buys the goren and the bakar bekesef shkalim chamishim, for 50. Now, first of all, it says kesef, but it also says 50 shkalim. 600 shkalim, 50 shkalim. Big difference. HaKetzad. Goveh mikol shevet v'shevet chamishim shem shesh me'ot. So the way they resolve it is, he gathered 50 shekel from each tribe. 50 times 12 is 600. Perfect. Rabbi Omer Mishuma Rabbi Abba Yosai ben Dostai Bakar ve'etzim comes back b'chamishim v'kol habayit kulo b'sheshma. We have no idea how this connects yet. Don't worry. So the bakar and the etzim and the makom is back, that he bought. Now, he bought bakar, if you know, animals, and he bought wood, and he bought the place for the altar. That all cost him 50, but the rest of the land cost 600. Rabbi Lazar ben Shamoah agrees with Rabbi Abba, with this Abba ben Yossi ben Dostai, but he brings a pasuk to prove it, and that's going to be our key thing. Rabbi Lazar ben Shamoah, he's the one we're looking for. Bakar ve'etzim makom is back b'chamishim v'kol habayit kulo b'shesh me'ot. How do we know that? Dichtiv. Vayomer Ravana el David, Yikach vayal Adoni HaMelech hatov beinav. Okay, go take whatever you want. Re'ah bakar lo'olav ha'moragim u'klei bakar leitzim. And here's the bakar for your olah. Here's the moragim and the klei bakar for the wood. Meaning, take it from my utensils. Like I have some implements there. Okay, we're going to see the klei bakar, the threshing implements. Take them for the wood. Here, what does it sound like? He's using that as his proof, right? It looks like you can use the wood, because David was buying that, which was used wood. How's Rava going to answer that? It was new utensils. It had never been used before. Okay, now we're just off on a tangent. It said that he bought the moragim uklei bakar leitzim. Okay, so what are the moragim? My moragim. Amar ula mitashel torbel. A torbel bed. Okay, my mitashel torbel. What is that? That didn't help us. Okay, this is a threshing implement that they used that had teeth in it. Okay, we're going to see Amar Abai Mikra. Where do you get this? Where do you get this from a pasuk? This is a prophecy about the Jewish people. You're going to be like a threshing implement, that you're going to be able to basically just thresh all the other nations and win the battles. Okay, you're going to be like a brand new morag that's serrated, brand new, with all these teeth in them. Okay, I was just trying to figure out what that word was. Now, there's one thing we didn't resolve in this pasuk, and when Rava was reading this pasukim, he brought up this contradiction. First, the first one, K'tiv vayiken David la'arnon, uchtiv vayiken David, haketzad, goveh mikol shevet v'shevet chamishim shem shesh me'ot. So Rava basically explains the resolution to the contradiction, not the way the second two explanations did, but the first one, which is each tribe took 50, that equals 600, as opposed to the other ones who said 50 was for all the stuff and the place of the altar, but 600 was for the rest of the land. But there's still a difficulty. Hatam kesef hachazav. One says silver, one says gold. Ela hachi kamra. This is the way to read it. Govek kesef b'mishkal shesh me'ot zahav. He took it he paid it in shkalim of kesef. That's why it says, if you look back at the pasuk, vayiken et hagorim ve'et habakar bekesef shkalim. He bought it with silver coins. Bekesef, comma. Shkalim chamishim, but the weight of the silver was like 50 of gold. And then that explains the silver and the gold. It was that the weight was in gold, but the actual currency was silver. Okay, last part for today. Kodshim kalim nechalim b'chol machane Yisrael. Okay, this is in the time of the desert. Where would they eat the kodshim kalim? Anywhere in the camp. Remember how they camped? There was the center, which was the machane. We call it machane shechina. Then there was the hour with the Leviim camped around that, and then all the other tribes camped around, right? 3, 3, 3, 3, all around the square. That's machane Yisrael. But comes Rav Huna and he says something strange. Amar Rav Huna, b'chol makomot Yisrael, anywhere that Jews were. Okay, that seems strange. It's what happened to the camp. So, Tevet Rav Nachmani Rav Huna, machanot b'midbar lo hava. What, you think there weren't machanot in the midbar? We all know there were machanot in the midbar. How so? Because Hatanya, it says in the Braita, and the machanot that had significance of, again, this is all true in terms that's relevant for where the Tameh people, right, Tameh Maid and Sarua and Zav, and right, the Mitzvah has to leave all the camps, the Zav has to leave 2 camps, the Tameh leaves 1 camp, right? We have all these rules, and it says, Kashem shamachaneh b'midbar, kach machaneh b'Yerushalayim. In other words, they all have their comparable, whatever was in the time of the desert, where there were these camps. So how could you say there were no camps? It all parallels what there was in the temple. And this we've seen a few times. We'll see it again now, explicit. Yerushalayim lahar habayit machane Yisrael, right? The machane Yisrael in the Midbar, where all the Jews camped, that you could eat kodshim kalim. Where can you eat kodshim kalim? In the time of the temple? From all the borders of Jerusalem, again, which is not Jerusalem nowadays, but the wall of Jerusalem, until Har HaBayit. Me Har HaBayit l'shar Nikanor Machane Leviyah. From the Har HaBayit till you get to the Nikanor gate, which leads into the Azara, that's Machane Leviyah. Mikam va'elach Machane Shechina. And from in the Azara, that's Machane Shechina, and that's why Kodshim, right, you can only eat in there. Elu hen kla'im shebamidbar, okay, and that's the same thing as the kla'im, as we say, inside the kla'im, inside the curtains of the Ol Moed, that's the same as the Azara. So how could you say there were none? Ela ema b'chol makom machane Yisrael. It says, no, anywhere where machane Yisrael is, there you could eat the kodshim kalim. So the Gemara says, pshita, that's obvious. Say, no, well, ma'u detemi paslu b'yotze kamashmona. Now, what happened in the desert? They got up, and they moved, and they took apart the Mishkan. So what he's saying is, now, when they moved, right, according to many of the opinions, they moved as a camp. So the camp is still intact, even though it's moving. However, the Mishkan is taken apart. So you might have thought that when the Mishkan is taken apart, maybe everything is considered now Yotze, because, right, maybe it's as if it left the camp, and maybe it's disqualified, and when you go back and settle in the new place, maybe you can't eat the meat or anything that couldn't be eaten because it was already disqualified. As they were moving, it seems like they all think that you have to eat it only when the Mishkan's intact. But was it disqualified on the way? So you might have thought it was. Comes Rav Huna when he says, B'chol makomot Yisrael, it means anywhere they moved. That's what he was trying to tell us. Okay, one last thing. Before we get to the one last thing, maybe it is true. Maybe it is pasul b'yotze. Maybe you're right. No, because Amar Krav and Asa Ol Moed. It says Ol Moed would move with them. Now, Ol Moed was taken apart. So where they say, Ol Moedu, even though it's moving, it's still called Ol Moed, so therefore there is no Psul Yotze while they're moving. Tanya Rabbi Shmuel ben Yochai Omer, Rabbi Shmuel ben Yochai adds, Od Acheret Haita, V'chel Ezrat Nashim Hi. There were actually 4 camps, okay? We never really heard about this. What's the 4th? Well, if you remember, in the map, right, there's this big rectangle, and half of it is the Azara, and the Hechal within it. The other half is what we call the Ezrat Nashim. And that area is considered its own separate camp. But lo hayu onshim aleha. Okay, but you wouldn't get punished if a tamei person went in there. Tameim are allowed in there; they're just not allowed in the Azara. But it's its own separate camp. We'll talk about the mashmut of this later. Ubeshilo lo hayu elashte machanot b'lvad. But in Shiloh there were actually only 2 camps, and we're going to start with that tomorrow and figure out what the 2 camps were. Which camps in the Mishkan or in the desert are parallel to the ones in the Mishkan and Shiloh. So what did we do today? We started with this long Braita that we had yesterday with all the details about what happened before the Mishkan was built. We went through where we got Scharim, Nekevot, Tmimim, Valei Mumim, but not Rashi Varim, and we had a whole long discussion about that. Then we had Torim, Avalot, Tmeim. How did they know kosher, non-kosher, right? First of all, it means in the future, what will be kosher, non-kosher, and then how did Noach know to bring them into the ark? Then we had the Al-Koker Vu'alot in the Braita, and then it sounds like not Shlamim, and we saw the whole big machloket. Can B'nai Noach bring Shlamim or not in each psukim that they each brought, and how that was affected by this machloket of was Yitro before or after, and that's all related to the fact that he brought Shlamim. That they could bring Shlamim, then it's fine. If they couldn't bring Shlamim, then you have to say it happened after Matan Torah, and that fit in with one of the three opinions about what Yitro heard and what caused him to convert. From there, we got to the very last line of the Bereishit, Goyim b'zman hazeh v'shein lasoken, and we had the whole story of Ofer Hormiz and how we can help them, but we can't actually do sacrifices for them, even though nowadays they can actually bring sacrifices. And then we started with this, right, then from there, just quick, we got to, right, then we just got into this whole thing about the Ofer Hormiz and her story, and why he specifically said, take it from the new. And from that, we got into Rabbi Elazar ben Shammai, and Abaye said, I understand, Rabbi, why did you say you had to take the new? It doesn't make any sense in light of something else Rabbi Elazar ben Shammai said, and that got us all into the contradictory psukim in Sefer Shmuel and Divrei Hayamim. And from there, we ended with the Kodshim Kalim. We went back to the Mishnah now, that until that was all just going over parts of that long Breita from yesterday. It wasn't even such a long Breita, but we had a long discussion about each of the parts. Then we went back to the Mishnah Kodshim Kalim Yachalim B'chol Machanei Yisrael and the statement of Rav Huna, which wasn't really comprehensible, to which we then explained it. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.